Well, hello and welcome to the first of our summer series Best Of collection from VLGA Connect. And we're starting with an interview you might not have seen. This interview's been locked away as member-only content for the past few weeks. It's from the VLGA's Annual General Meeting, where we were joined by the President of the Richmond Football Club, incoming Chancellor of RMIT University and 2021 Melburnian of the Year, Peggy O'Neal AO. This is really exciting for many of us to get to speak with our guest speaker today, and I'm sure many of you are really looking forward to this as well. And I would like to say at the outset, if you have questions for our guest speaker, Peggy O'Neal, please pop them in the chat window as we go, and we'll endeavour to get to as many of those as possible. But to formally introduce our guest speaker, Peggy O'Neal is the president of the Richmond Football Club, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and has been since 2013, the first woman in AFL history to serve as a club president. She was named on the Australian Financial Review's list of top 100 women of influence in 2019. She was appointed to the as an officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to Australian rules football, to superannuation and finance law, and to the advancement of women in leadership roles. She is the incoming Chancellor of RMIT University, and as of this week, has been announced as the Melburnian of the Year. It is my great pleasure to welcome this afternoon our guest speaker, Peggy O'Neal AO. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Chris. Thank you.
You're getting a virtual round of applause there. Welcome.
Thank you to the audience too. Thanks.
Now, we had a bit of a chat the other day about a few things to talk about, and one thing that struck me is we're going to have trouble getting through everything we'd like to pick your brain about in 30 minutes. But here goes. One thing you said to me that struck me as really interesting, Peggy, is that culture and governance, which is part of our theme for today, are the same thing. So why do you say culture and governance are the same?
People often say, what is culture? And it's that fuzzy thing that, you know it when you see it, sort of thing. And I've been asked about that before. And I started thinking there's one definition that sort of, some have articulated, and I sort of accept that, culture is the way we do things around here. It's what's accepted. It's the standards we accept. And so then when I was thinking a bit about governance, and I thought, well, that's the way we do things around here too. And they've got to be linked. The structures you put in place that aren't for just show, but they really guide the way that you expect people to behave and guide the decision-making. I think both, and especially, governance, we think about the whole point of having a governance structure is that it provides some checks and balances to lead to better decision-making. But unless culture is there to reinforce those decisions, you can have all kinds of strategy, but if the culture doesn't support it, then you're not going to get anywhere. So I think that culture and governance really go hand in hand and are just, different sides of the same coin almost. Yeah. I don't think you can separate the two. So that's sort of what I meant, that they're the same, is both of them are indications of what an organization values and the way it behaves.
So one of the things you've been recognised for is that work you do to promote the advancement of women in leadership roles. Can you reflect on perhaps the first time you found yourself in a leadership role? What was that experience like? What do you recall from it?
Well, if I cast my mind back, when you think as a leadership role is when you find yourself at the front of an organization, I would be the 15-year-old who's head of the local Girl Scout troop. And I took my responsibility very seriously. I'm not so sure it was leadership. It might have been bullying people into doing what I wanted. But I think we were the only Girl Scout troop up in the mountains of Virginia with the Constitution and bylaws. And for some reason, I thought it would be a good idea on meeting days, which was after school, but that all of us should have to wear our Girl Scout uniform to school that day. And we don't have school uniforms in America, at least the public schools that I went to. And if you didn't, you had to pay a fine. I don't know what happened to that fine money. I didn't spend it myself. But looking back, I thought, well, I thought structure was important. I thought we ought to have lots of rules, and that may be why I became a lawyer. I think it was a good indication that rules mattered to me. But I realize now that a lot of those people didn't care as much as I cared. But at the same time, I wasn't big on persuasion. I was just big on sort of telling people what to do, I suppose. Maybe I was just a bossy person. And then over time, you hope you mature as a person and you get a better idea of yourself and the way in which you want to involve yourself in an organization. And I think all of leadership is about caring a lot for the organization in which you're involved. And if you care enough, you want to see make a contribution, you might want to make some change. But we only really, I think, show leadership when we're involved with an organization that means something to us, that we care about its purpose, its mission, its clientele. And that's what I sort of find, that you pick and choose where you want to be a leader. Might be involved in many organizations, but some of them will speak to your heart and you think, I want to be more involved in this, and over time perhaps become a leader. But with maturity, I hope I'm a bit more subtle about things now than I used to be.
Back in those Girl Scout days, did anyone actually pay the fines?
Well, of course they did. I would go and get them if they didn't. I think we made we would have a little, trip. We would go camping or something. I think that's where the money went. We had a treasurer. We had a big structure for a troop of 10 girls. We had a lot, a lot of minutes and bylaws and all those kinds of things that lawyers love. I didn't know that's what I was going to be, but looking back on it, I think there was every indication.
A predictor of the future. What was your first board leadership role? What was the first board you led?
I'm trying to think. I was, it's sort of like there is Victoria, but the legal system in America, because I went to school over there and started my legal career for a year or two. But there was the young lawyers division of the equivalent of the law council. And I became the chair of that. And so there was a representative body from different parts of the state. And we put on seminars. We raised money for various causes. We invested that money in things to do with justice and the legal system and all of that. So that was probably my first year. You were elected for a year, and so that really taught me a lot about bringing people together, getting things to work because people wanted to work, not because I told them to, and understanding that when you're dealing with volunteers, as we all were, and a lot of what I do now is still volunteers on boards, that you have to accept that things don't always go at the pace that you want. So there was that one, and probably the not-for-profit or professional responsibility sort of thing. And but then I was trying to think, probably the first role where I actually was in a commercial situation is after I moved to Australia, and I was a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills, because when you're a partner in a law firm, they really don't like you doing too much more than being partner in a law firm. Things have changed a little bit, but not too much. And but one of my very good clients, their chair had to be an independent person in order for them to operate. And he unfortunately suddenly died. And they needed someone to fill in until they could do a proper search and all of that. And because it was for a good client, I was allowed to serve in that capacity for, it was supposed to be 6 months, 18 months later, I was still there. I thought that they went a bit slow on the recruiting once they had someone in, but, and that was a real eye opener because as a lawyer, you often think that your advice is the only one that matters, is what is the board doing? And this gave me a really good view of all of the information that a board has to I guess, digest in order to arrive at a decision. And you realize that the legal advice is just to say it's legal, and then they have all the commercial things, the personnel things that I hadn't had to take into account, because in essence, my advice was always on a pretty narrow point of law. So that was probably the first one. And like I say, I learned a lot. And so I went from not even being on the board to being chair. I did have some understanding of it from being their legal counsel, but those are probably my first two. So the Girl Scouts to running the Superfund.
So what's different about, if anything, about your approach now to leadership? Think about the Richmond Football Club. You've been the president for, 8 years? Is your approach to leadership different now than it was then, or have you got a tried and true set of principles that you still apply?
Well, it's often when you're involved in things like that, you don't really stop to think about, what principles am I exhibiting here, or what do I fall back on? I think I think that my approach has probably matured a bit. I think that if you're lucky, and hopefully as you have more interaction with people as you age, you get to know yourself pretty well, and what your values are and what you stand for. I think leadership more and more is about persuasion. It's realizing that as chair of a board, you're just one person. You're, first among equals maybe, but you just have one vote. And I often think that people say they want to be on boards, but if you don't like being on a committee, you don't want to be on a board, because it's just a big committee. And I know some of the counselors on this call may think the same thing, that you have a voice, but you're not the only voice, and you have to deal with objections, and that is all to balance out making the best decision that you can. Now it has to be constructive conversation. So I think my approach to leadership now is a bit more be patient, let everybody have a say, and once a decision is made, if everyone has had an opportunity to have input, and perhaps it still didn't go their way, but we always say, can you nonetheless fully support the decision? And if you say, no, I can't fully support that decision, then it's probably not the right board for you, because that's the idea, is you don't win them all, but you've got to say there was a collective decision, and I'm part of that collective, so I'm behind it. So I think I've learned a lot of patience, and I've also learned that there are very few things that are urgent. There's probably nothing that can't wait for another week or another day, or if someone wants some more information, or if things are getting a bit heated, just to let the heat go out of the situation. And a lot of it is just how you deal with people, and being able to read the room a bit. So I think I've gotten better at that.
A lot of what we're talking about obviously is being looked at by our audience through the lens of local government, these leadership questions, which we're deliberately asking you. How much does the board take credit for the success on the field? So thinking about the Richmond Football Club, it's been a golden era. That leadership at the board level, does it impact on the ground?
Oh, we all like to think so, don't we? I think that that what you learn, or what has worked, is we all have a role to play, and the board really understands its role, which is mostly making money or coming up with the money. But that's not exactly right. But the board sort of sets the strategy. I like to think that in everything we do, we're ambassadors for the organization, and I think everyone on a board ought to consider themselves a reflection of the organization. So whatever you do in public, people will judge your organization by how you do it. I know that at Richmond, as a board, we're very mindful of we're there in a governing role, a supervisory role. We aren't there as management. You go out and you hire the best people that you can for the job. And so, while it's hard sometimes in football when everybody thinks they could be the coach, but we're very aware of we're there to monitor. We're not there to go tell the coach how to do their job. And I often wonder, why did you bother to hire the best person for the job if you, with no credentials, going to go down and tell them how to do it? And I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, they had actually left organizations, not our football club, because they couldn't do their job, because everybody had an opinion about how it would be done, and they thought if you get really good people, they want to go out and do something exciting and challenging and push themselves, and if they can't do that because they're sort of cut off at every turn, and the board decides to run the place. So I think at Richmond, we understand that we're part of the success, that we do our bit. The CEO and his exec team does their bit, the coach does his bit, and then the team has to go out and execute on the day. They do the big bit that you're judged by. But if we don't get the off-field stuff right, then the on-field success would never have happened. Yeah. And a lot of that is understanding what your role is.
I think there's some real synergies there with councils and organisations and performance. Peggy, there's a string of questions coming in now from the audience, so we'll get to those if you don't mind, and we'll work through as many of these as we can in the time that we have. So firstly, Louise asks, what is the most difficult thing about getting everyone to head in the same direction and be united at that board level?
To get them all united is the most difficult thing. Well, I think at board level, there are a number of things you can do for people to have an opportunity to express themselves. I think that, as I said before, if you can't get behind whatever the decision is, that's where the unity is needed. And I know in a couple of issues that have become public, for example, at Richmond, is the board never wavered or went back on, or let's rethink this, because we had spent a great deal of time thinking it through. Everybody had a say. Someone couldn't say, oh, you forced that on me. If someone needed another couple of weeks or wanted more information, we just, like extending the coach's contract, we took that time. And then when it gets really sticky or someone is challenging that decision, no matter what it might be, the board as a whole had nothing to do except we made that decision. We'll stand by that decision. And so I think it's a matter of hearing from everyone, being respectful of everyone, and again, at the end saying, can you support the decision? And I think that it does so much damage if there are people on a board who work against the board. And that is sometimes you only find out after someone's leaked something or it's in the press, or and that just does such damage, because if you can't trust each other around a board table, how are you ever going to get much work done? You spend more time managing the possibility of dissent in an unconstructive way. The constructive dissent is what happens around the table. But a lot of times, if people think that only they have the right view, they're the ones who decide if they lose that they're going to sort of take it out on the board, which goes back to what I said before. If you can't work on a committee, then you shouldn't be on a board, because there's no individual power on a board. I don't have the individual power. It's a collective. And I think that lots of times that's difficult to express until you see it.
Exactly the same for councils, of course. So you're sort of getting into that space of, councils, boards, they pretty much all sign on to a set of agreed values. As a chair, what's your approach to dealing with those types of situations when people don't abide by the values in terms of accountability? Have you had to deal with that personally?
Yes, but as you say, the values and every board that I've been on or am on now, we have a board charter, and we sort of in that charter set out how we promise to each other that we're going to operate, what our values are, maybe a few rules about how our code of conduct. But the thing is, you have to enforce that, but it also gives you a framework. So if you see someone, for example, if it says everything that happens in the boardroom is confidential, and then you find out someone's leaked it and you know who that is, then you can go and say, but see, we all agreed to this, and we know now that you're not abiding by that. Maybe, it depends on the severity or what the topic might be. And maybe give a warning. But if it's severe enough, as a board, you say, well, you don't have our confidence anymore. And that's easier when some of us have been elected anyway, like the Richmond board, you were all elected as well. So they're tough conversations, but again, as I said before, if you're spending so much time dealing with bad behavior, outside the boardroom, or even instances of bad behavior in the boardroom. I know one board that I was on, someone came on, star in his field, but could not be part of a board. And if he didn't get his way, on occasion, he called us stupid. He just said, you're stupid. And I think we can't sit around a board table and be treated that way. I think it's the chair's role. I wasn't the chair of that particular one, but the chair that was did the same thing, is that the chair's role is to talk to that person and to make them realize that one, it's not acceptable. And secondly, that their time is numbered because it just takes so much energy to manage bad behavior. And as adults, we ought to be able to control ourselves a bit better.
I'm seeing that's really resonating with the audience, Peggy, that stream of thought there. A question from Gillian. What do you think about the recent statements about a board reboot post-COVID, where roles, purpose and structures are rethought to fit a different future? Do you sign on to that?
I haven't read too much about that because I think boards have been working really hard during COVID, depending on what industry you're in, to manage, personnel, to manage whatever your product is that that you've been producing. For example, football is what we turn out football games. Well, when nobody can attend, and you have to lay off staff, and you have to have all these COVID protocols that are stricter than even the state governments. So I think boards have done pretty well. I think there's a lot of knowledge that's been gained through COVID about how to deal with the unexpected. So I would think there's a bit of a storehouse of knowledge. It could be that some directors are just tired and they may want to move on and have some new people come in. But I think there has been a lag, a couple of boards that I'm on, in trying to set the next strategy, because it's so uncertain. And in both of those, independently, the decision was made to continue with the current strategy through until 2022, the mid-year. Both of them were coming up for renewal and some more long-term thinking. And it was, well, let's just see how it goes. Because at the end of 2020, we thought we were going to be okay in 2021. And now hopefully we're okay for 2022 and with the vaccinations and things like that. So I think I don't see wholesale change, but I think if you've made it through the last couple of years as a director, you've gained a lot of skills in how to handle uncertainty.
Great question, Gillian. Thank you. Now, Lydia would like to hear from you a little bit about your role in community housing and some of the obstacles that you've encountered in this area. This is a real hot button topic for councils at the moment.
Well, I'm on the board of Women's Housing, and I'm also on the Investment Advisory Committee of Home for Homes, which is an initiative with a big issue trying to fund housing for very vulnerable people. But Women's Housing is a housing association under Victorian Registrar of Housing, and it's been in existence for more than, well, we had our 21st birthday a few years ago. So we had a 21st birthday party for ourselves. And I've been on the board for about 7 years, going on 8 years. I guess the problems for the people, one is enough housing. Secondly is the funding for housing. Minister Wynn's announcement, women's housing got quite, I think we got a big chunk of that money. And we're going to regional Victoria to try to help with housing out in the West. Some locally, but a lot of it out in the West because there was a real need out there. There's always shortage of supply. There's always, not often, people don't want that housing in their neighborhood, even if it is for women who are fleeing domestic violence and it's all anonymous. And so there's still a certain stigma if you're in that housing. Some communities welcome it, see it's a real benefit to the people who live in it. So I don't know that that's changed. COVID was, heightened worry about COVID going through properties, and it did. Not that anyone was really sick because there were all kinds of protocols. And one of the things we do at Women's Housing is try to connect the women who are there to all the other social services and to bring it together as a package so that they don't have to navigate too much of that themselves. Some of the properties we have right now, we inherited, and they're in the wrong place, not near public transportation, difficult to get to. So the new designs that we do, we always think, is it near a shopping center? Could someone walk there? What are schools? Where are they nearby? Doesn't mean we always get those, but so I guess that it's something I feel passionate about because homelessness is the first thing you need to solve to get people back on the path to any sort of stability. Also, the worry that the fastest growing segment of poverty is women over 50 and homelessness that arises from that after a lifetime of raising families or working and through all kinds of reasons find themselves homeless, and it's going to be a huge issue in the future. So I guess I don't know if that's answered the question, but the issue is usually we need more money, and we need better community reception.
Yes, yes. And lots of councils are dealing with that issue that you've talked about, where communities they're fearful. They don't understand necessarily, or the NIMBYism rears its head. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but have you got any particular advice for how councils can have that conversation in the right way with their communities?
We've done a lot of community consultation, and right now we, for example, have one community that's really welcoming and great coverage in the local paper, and another one that there's going to be a protest, and it's sort of not really logical. But then we think, well, that's a communication exercise, and we find that the more we do community consultation, the more we open it up, the more we educate, the more that we inform, most of those fears drop away. We've never had anything not go ahead because of that. And usually if a little bit of an accommodation goes a long way. And maybe instead of building 40 units, we'll have 35. Or instead of, and sometimes it's about parking. Sometimes it's not dealing with the people who live in it. It's about increased number of cars and congestion and things like that. So I think at first it's to identify the issue, and community consultation just goes a long way. And again, people getting heard.
Peggy, I want to get at least one more question in. I'm going to pick one from Tony, who's reflecting on your success in sectors that have traditionally been male dominated. What sort of reflection or advice do you have on effective ways for business and local government to encourage and assist with all gender participation?
That's a question for the ages, isn't it? I remember when I came out of law school all those years ago, they said, oh, well, now that there are more women going to law school. There were, I think, 30 in my class, and that was more than had graduated in the history of the law school, but it was 30 out of 180. So that gives you a chance, or an idea. It's still a long way to go. Over time, I've found or come to believe that one, you have to want to make it happen. You have to go out and find the people that you want. Most women don't apply for jobs. You hear all the time, well, we didn't get any applications for that. Some women must not be interested. And it's because you're not going to waste your time if you think you don't have a chance. And if you commit to every time a job goes up, we're going to go and make sure that there are women or all genders, all types of people in the mix, over time, people start to believe that they will have a legitimate opportunity there, that they aren't just making up the numbers. And then when they start to see themselves represented and people making more of an effort, then they're going to come along, and the whole complexion of the organization changes as well. For example, at Richmond, I was, the first woman on the board, and we had a number of committees that operate, and after a while, when we started looking at why aren't more women members, because our membership was going up, but the percentage of women wasn't, the number of women wasn't, and we looked closely and said, oh well, would you want to come to our functions when all the collateral that's put out about sign up is all men drinking beer. So just little things like that about the signals that you send. Then with our committees, I said, well, why doesn't every committee chair make a pledge to go find an external woman to be on that? Let's start with the women thing first, and then we can move on from there. And it was done almost immediately. There were all these women who were interested in doing more for the club, and they did. And now we have a majority of women on the Richmond Football Club board, and every one of them came through the committees. Oh. Every one of them. Oh. And so now we're moving on to make sure that we represent, multicultural Australia, Indigenous Australia. And it might be sort of easier for me to say because sport is of interest to so many people. But if you open the doors and you're serious about it, and sometimes you don't wait for people to come to you, you go out and find them and just ask them to take part in the process, that sort of shows you're serious. But on the day-to-day basis, your CEO and the executive team have to carry this. It's not the board. And they have to be committed to it as well. And if the board sets that as part of strategy, which we did, then we just hold them accountable if it doesn't happen.
You mentioned the Richmond Football Club again there. Perhaps a last question. How does a girl from West Virginia find her way into Australian rules football, or did it find you?
Oh, well, you couldn't be in Melbourne for too long before you realize you have to have a team. And I moved to Richmond, and I still live in Richmond. And so my suburb, the name of my suburb had a team. And I've always a great sports fan growing up in these little towns, and like small town everywhere. The sporting clubs are a big social thing, and high school sports big in America. And so I said, well, I've got to pick a team, and I did. And I can walk to the MCG and went to games. And after a couple of games, I was just going to more games and more games and more games. And it's a great sport. So I just loved the sport right away. I didn't have to take too much convincing on that. And over time, give it 20 years or so, found myself on the board.
And the rest is history. Peggy, we're going to have to wrap it up. That's been very enjoyable for me, and I hope for our audience as well. I wonder if I can call on the audience for a virtual round of applause. I'm seeing it without any prompting. Thank you very much. Really appreciate talking to you. And I do want to point out that in lieu of a speaker's fee today, the VLGA, on your behalf, Peggy, will be making a donation to Women's Housing Limited and to the Madeline Foundation. So thank you very much for that as well. It's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
Nice to talk to you, Chris.
We hope you enjoyed that special edition of VLGA Connect from the Annual General Meeting featuring Peggy O'Neal. There's more to come from our summer series Best Of collection. Look out every Monday and Wednesday over summer for new features. We look forward to having you with us soon.